A few have expressed concerns about the broad diversity of organic materials that are recycled here at Prosperity Homestead. They're concerned about windowed envelopes, newsprint, cardboard, all kinds of organic waste, and I'm going to address that right now. Hi, I'm Justin Hitt with Prosperity Homestead. We compost all paper mail, so this is non-glossy paper mail, which very often does include windowed envelopes. We don't pull the windowed envelopes out anymore. We compost all of our kitchen waste, including meat and bones. We compost pretty much all the cardboard that comes through. All the plastic is torn off of it, and that is used as weed barrier. And essentially, nearly everything that comes through the property is recycled in some way, shape, or form. Now, this recycling system is not perfect. I'm not going to talk about the accumulation of my garage, having all those materials pile up so quickly. And I'm not going to talk about reducing waste. We do put a lot of effort into reducing the amount of waste that we have and moving a preference towards organic materials that compost. Like, for example, I got a whole drawer full of old toothbrushes. And we try to use the toothbrushes on stuff many times before we eventually put them in recycling or throw them in the trash. But I'm going to move towards a biodegradable toothbrush because then I can just use it a bunch of times and then throw it in the compost. But right now, this podcast is going to focus on the household recycling program, specifically organic waste, because the concern that was raised was the windowed envelopes have plastic windows. Well, that's not always the case. We actually have seen windowed envelopes with starch windows. So that clear window is actually starch. It's not plastic. I've looked into that. There's a number of manufacturers that are putting out windowed envelopes that are starch-based. Now, there are many that are plastic, and what happens when plastic breaks down is it becomes microplastics, estrogen components, and other types of chemicals in the waste, which then can get drawn up into plants and then accumulated in your body. So this is a very real risk. However, I'm going to share with you the 3-step program that we use to minimize the amount of plastics that are accumulated on the property or otherwise incorporated into our nursery system, because the specific path in which people were concerned was that paper becomes compost, compost becomes worm castings, and worm castings are used in the nursery. So there isn't the broadacre bioaccumulation or the broadacre turning waste into grasses, for example, then composting those grasses and turning things into long-chain carbons. And by the way, bioaccumulation is where nutrients are forming in an area and then they're setting in the soil over a long period of time and the soil becomes rancid. So it could be street runoff into a drainage ditch that accumulates petroleum products, heavy metals, and our rubber and other types of plastic wastes. It could be the bioaccumulation that happens from our feces and our urine products, where pharmaceuticals carry through urine and feces, and then human manure then accumulates over time. Again, heavy metals, pharmaceuticals, E. coli, and other things. All of those areas and those concerns are legitimate. And those concerns should drive you to understanding the practical principles of hot composting. And I say hot composting because most elements in the environment other than heavy metals will break down over 150 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you have a system in place that heats the compost and processes the compost, it will break down a lot of these things as well. But let me just cover my 3-step system. It's a deliberate and intentional approach to composting household waste, especially those items that folks are asking about, the newspaper or the boxes and stuff. So here we go. First off is we remove as much of the negative material as possible. So this is a removal. This is kind of step 0, so it's really 4 steps, but this is part of that everyday use. So we try to reduce this is like a given. We try to reduce the amount of plastics that come into the household. We would go, for example, when we buy mushrooms from the grocery store, we buy the mushrooms in the cardboard container with a little film of plastic wrap over top of them, rather than the mushrooms that are in the plastic container that we would have to use for something else. So we're reducing the waste coming into the property. This is step 0, removal and reduction of plastics. Now, I don't remove the windowed envelopes. It takes a lot of time. I will simply tear up the envelope, I'll tear it once, throw it in a paper bin, and that paper bin once a week or so is dumped into a composting bin as its carbon source. Now, I did this because when I researched the envelopes, much of the non-gloss, non-shiny windowed envelopes. So if you see a window envelope and it's super shiny, that's likely plastic. But if it's kind of a hazy clear, or it's only super clear when you push it up against the newsprint or the paper print, then it's likely a starch-based or a biologically based plastic. It doesn't mean that it's going to biodegrade right away. But again, I would include that. But if I see something that's really kind of hard, like plastic-wise, I don't put that into the paper system. I also tear off all of the tapes and any kind of sticky label that is obviously plastic. So the basis of this is that we've removed a majority of the material before we got started. But step number 1 is that we cultivate a biome that breaks down a wide spectrum of materials. This is very important. This is bacterias, fungal material, funguses, microbes. We're cultivating that in our compost. Our compost is a living biome, a living system that breaks down the widest spectrum of nutrients, the widest spectrum of plastics and materials, the widest spectrums of wood types, and we ultimately have this system in place. This is a system. So we might inoculate a pile with materials. And a simple example is if you're doing human manure, you can inoculate your human manure with Riddex, which is a stuff you put into your septic system. Whether you're using a biodigester for the human manure or you're using a dry system for your human manure, there is a series of steps that inoculate the system so that it has the right creatures in there that will break down the materials and remove things. So for example, there are creatures that are thermophilic, which will heat up your composting pile to get it over 150 degrees, and they're doing that by consuming all the food that they can possibly consume. There's actually even microbes or bacteria that eats PET, which is a petroleum product plastic. It actually eats it and turns it into long-chain carbons. This thing has to be in place. Now, how do you know? You know because you're inoculating your pile. So, for example, the Riddex for human manures. You can put Riddex in your regular compost. It's basically microorganisms. We use raw milk at times or kefir. So after we make a smoothie, the liquid that comes off of when we clean the materials, we actually take that gray water liquid and we put it in the compost pile, which will put digestive enzymes into the compost. We'll use different kinds of powders that contain spores for fungus, and we've selected this wide spectrum type of product. Now, we have a product recommendation list that you can get by visiting us at www.prosperityhomestead.org, but very often you can make these with compost tea. You can make this with various types of soil samples that you have around your property. But ultimately, this wide spectrum biome is eating up these materials, and it's breaking down into long chain carbon. It's locking up the things that are bad in that compost. Next, number 2 is we have at least 3 hot composting cycles before we use the compost. So I use a compost tumbler, which is an enclosed system that we turn every day so that we keep it hot all the time. And a hot compost is a compost that's breaking down materials. Now, in order to get your compost hot, it has to be the right combination of carbon, greens, and other materials. So we're not composting organic household waste by itself. I grow biomass on the property. I use leaves. I use other materials to blend in there so that about 50% by weight is not from the household. So this paper to compost to worms to nursery is actually using a large amount of wood chips. It's using leaves. It's using grasses and straws in order to supplement the carbon side of this so that we have nice, hot, clean compost. Because we actually do put some of this raw compost. I keep track of how many cycles. So it's gone 3 hot cycles, and then some of that compost will go into the worm bins. The worms will actually eat that biome. They eat all this material. But the last part is that we sift the materials before we take it to the nursery. Now, when we sift the materials, we do find small pieces of plastic. We find wrappers. We find thin layers of things that look like it was compostable, but it had a thin layer of plastic over the top. We take those things out, but everything that is not small enough, we use a 1/4-inch screen. It doesn't go through a 1/4-inch screen. All of that stuff is sorted, sifted, and then put back in the compost tumbler. Now, I'm going to sift out bones. I'm going to sift out rocks. I'm going to sift out materials that are too large. I'm going to take out the plastics. I'm going to take out papers. Some tea bags, for example, the tea bag itself doesn't compost. I'll take out all those materials, and that'll go into the plastics will go into the trash. The bones will go into a bucket to be turned into charcoal, and then the rocks and things will be put in a gravel bucket to be used elsewhere. So there's this sifting cycle, and we're ultimately sifting the materials to be used in a nursery, but we're also sifting materials that might top dress garden beds, that might go around trees, and it really depends on how much plastic I found in the sift. Now, often we will find materials that are plastics that are biodegradable. Now, remember, a biodegradable plastic very often needs high temperatures to break down, and it doesn't break down into soil. It breaks down into little tiny, tiny, tiny microscopic plastics. So if I'm seeing plastics in the mix, then there's, again, the inputs need to be checked, and the especially hard plastics. And then that particular compost is going to be more of a broad acreage compost. So it might have gone through the worm bins, but ultimately it'll go out onto a larger area that's going to grow grass, and then that grass will be an input into the compost system itself. My point being is that with these 3 steps, you don't have enough accumulation of those negative elements to be worried about. In fact, you're getting a lot more pharmaceuticals out of your drinking water. You're getting a lot more pharmaceuticals from the air and plastics from the air you're breathing. You're getting a lot more from commercially produced materials. But what you're not getting from those other sources is the broad spectrum microbiology that forms the soil food web. We want as much of that soil food web in that initial nursery material. So, for example, after it's sifted, we're going to add biochar. So it's going to be compost tea and inoculants put through charcoal and then crushed down and mixed with our composting cycles, but also mixed into our final nursery product. We might be adding vermiculite. We might be adding perlite. We might be adding other things that are nursery specific so that when that plant goes out into the garden, it's taking that little biome with it. We're being very thoughtful about our composting cycles so that we are actually producing good quality compost. So very often this household compost that's in the tumbler becomes inoculant for a larger composting pile. So what happens is the bulk compost that we produce is straight compost. There's no household materials in it. There might be animal manures, which of course has the risk of pharmaceuticals in it. But it's bulk compost, 2, 3, 4, even 8 cubic yards of material produced from mostly leaves and from wood chips and other materials that we get for free. But this household recycling organic compost is then used as an inoculant. So we will sift down at times to 1/8 of an inch screen depending on what we're doing. But we're pulling out the materials and using that as a meter to determine if our system is working the way it's supposed to. I can't control it when the kid throws a magazine into the composting bin. Sometimes those things get pulled out, sometimes they don't. But more importantly is that the waste streams are getting cleaner. So newspapers have a soy-based ink. The boxes, many boxes, once you pull the tape off of them, it's just a box. It's just paper. There's not a lot of bleach or anything in it. And a lot of the household windowed envelopes, as I mentioned before, are actually using a starch-based glue and a starch-based window, and it dissolves right away. Now, I am careful that I don't tear the window. I find that the windowed envelopes that won't compost, when you're turning the tumbler, you'll find those things and you can pull them out really quick. I keep a small bucket by the composter where I can pull out materials that don't look like they're breaking down very quickly. A starch-based windowed envelope will literally dissolve in a cup of water, so you could even test for yourself if the envelopes are starch-based. But ultimately, it's a single-flow system. The worms will eat out a lot of the coli or anything that might end up in there, because there was a concern at times with vegetables we get from the grocery store. So we're peeling off the banana peels. The banana peels have a lot of pesticides on them. Those are going into our composting system. Will those pesticides make it into our garden space? Well, no, we've had our compost tested. It doesn't contain anything. It's just compost. And that's because, again, the 3 steps that are described here, the cultivation of a biome that includes a wide spectrum of bacteria, fungal material, so that mycelium is growing in it, microbiology. We even have anaerobic cycles for some of our compost inputs. Again, we have a biodigester. We're producing our own effluent. And we're recycling urine, for example. All these things together gives us a very wide approach, a very strong ecosystem to then break down the materials. And we know it's got that wide spectrum because it easily goes into a hot cycle. We get 3 clean hot cycles before we then use those materials in the worm bins, or we use those materials in our nursery space. And number 3 is that we are sifting our materials to remove any large form materials and using that as an indicator about where that compost should be used or what's going on with our system. And what's interesting is that our finished compost that we use in the nursery, you can see tiny, tiny pieces of eggshells. I didn't break down those eggshells. I didn't go in there and crush the eggshells. I essentially threw them in how they were. I see little tiny, tiny pieces of materials and sometimes shells of seeds and other. It's very uniform, but I rarely see any powdered plastics, for example, or so I used to put shredded material in, so I would find a little bit of shredded material. But if your inputs are clean or at least screened, very often the output is just incredible. The plants grow wonderfully. I find that they inoculate the soil systems that they go into. And I also find that our composting path with the worms especially creates a quality of compost that if I was purchasing it outside, it just would be not cost effective at all. So there it is, folks. There's our 3 steps. It's built on a foundation of just having some good common sense to not put things in the compost that shouldn't be there. We don't have forks in our compost. We don't have any plasticware in our compost because we just don't. There's not that much plasticware in the house. But ultimately, we take the forks out before we scrape our plates. But we do compost meat, compost citrus. We compost pretty much everything. If I found I'll tell you, I found a dead cat. And I threw the dead cat in the compost. We had a fish that got scratched by a cat. I don't know if they're one and the same. Well, the cat died before the fish was even here. So the big fish, when it died, it went in the compost. The system itself, properly managed, takes care of a lot of these things. You can even compost steel cans, but we don't do that here. We focus on organics. If you have questions about composting, if you have questions about your first mile waste management, if you have questions about turning waste into energy, whether it's plant energy or even methane gas energy, You can visit us at www.prosperityhomestead.org. I'm Justin Hinn. I'm a permaculture design consultant, and in my professional life, I'm a business analyst, and I actually look at systems of function. And what we just described here is the 3 steps. It takes organic household waste, and very often you can produce 5 to 6 cubic yards a year of organic household waste, and turns it into wonderful, nutritious compost that is safe to use and feeds a plant system that grows abundance at your home. Again, thanks for listening. Send your questions to www.prosperityhomestead.org.